Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S.
And we're actually recording a week before this goes to air. So, Eugene, where are you right now?
Right now, I am in Duisburg, Germany. And tomorrow I'll be in Rotterdam. So if you haven't been able to figure it out, I am actually on tour with a gamey leg, no less. So it's been very fun. A big festival in Rotterdam tomorrow called Roadburn. So that'll be the end of a 13-show run. So I'm sort of glad to be done with it, so I can get surgery on my leg.
Oh, yeah, we were just talking before we hit record about various pain relievers that have worked for our gamey legs.
Well, actually, the one that you mentioned is an anti-inflammatory, which helps with
different.
Yeah. Painkiller would be nice, but an anti-inflammatory is probably what's more needed. And then, of course, the thing that was best of all was the cortisone shot that I got in my elbow. I thought magically that things are really working well for me. I'm doing like 100 push-ups and stuff because my elbow doesn't hurt anymore. And then it wore off. I was like, oh yeah, it was that cortisone shot.
So I tell you, getting older is not for the faint of heart, as it were.
What a drag it is getting old. That's Mick Jagger, who is, what is he, 85-year-old now with a 25-year-old girlfriend? That's got to stop. I'm sorry. It's got to stop.
Yeah. So we are at episode 55, and today we are going to be talking about weaponized incompetence.
Huh? I don't get it. Sorry. It's a double nickel show. I had to do something special.
So weaponized incompetence is when someone has the capacity, knowledge, ability, and understanding to complete a task, but they pretend that they don't, so they don't have to do the work.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So this is another phrase that's used to talk about this is the idea of learned helplessness. Okay. Yes. But to me, just to geek out for a second, there's a difference. So to me, learned helplessness is something that is done much more in relationship. So imagine a young person whose parents never teach him how to put in a load of laundry, cook an egg, take care of his finances. He is going to have a lack of capacity for adulting when he gets into the real world. That was something that was, his parents didn't help him in this regard, right? So learned helplessness is often done in kind of a dyad, right? There's two people who are saying, I can't do this. You're right. You can't do this. Let me do it for you, right?
Right.
Weaponized incompetence is something that I feel like is done much more intentionally. An example of this at work would be someone who doesn't want to be bothered doing the minutia of doing their expense reports. So they pretend they cannot operate the software to get someone else on their team to do it for them.
I'm laughing because I may have done something like this. I tell you the truth. Honest to God, when I was at Adobe, their process for putting in for your raise, your annual review was so Brobdingnagian that I was just like, I don't care. What's my bonus going to be? What's going to be $5,000, $6,000? I don't want to do it. I don't need the money. Screw it. I told my boss that. It's like, it's taking time out of my schedule when I can get really important stuff done. And she was like, yeah, you got to do it. I go, no, I don't. Look, I'm giving you guys back $6,000. She goes, but you don't understand. One of my KPIs is to get you to do your review. So if you don't do your review, I don't get my money, and my money's a lot more than $5,000. And I was like, oh, okay. So I had to buckle down and actually do it. But that was more, I was disclosing immediately that I could do it. I just didn't want to do it.
Weaponized incompetence. So one of the best examples is a bad boss that you know of, whose name or place of work we will not mention, but you freelanced for me at this place and worked for this guy.
Yes.
Very briefly. But he...
let's, for the sake of argument, call him Fred Flintstone.
Okay. So this particular bad boss was at the time, this is many years ago, at the time in his 30s. did not have, to my knowledge, any kind of, problem reading or difficulty with his eyesight, but he demanded that his executive assistant print out every single email he got. And this guy was the CEO of an ad agency, a large ad agency. Yeah. She had to print out every single email. He would handwrite the response on the piece of paper, give it back to her, and she then had to type it in and respond to the emails.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that's a really good example, because this was a man who, before he became CEO, clearly had the capacity and ability to respond to his emails. Right. He just chose not to.
I think that was also probably 50% just flex. Right.
Right.
Just, I'm doing this because I can. So.
Well, and that's what I've been listening to this song. It came out a couple of years ago called Labor by Paris Paloma. And it talks about the emotional labor that women do. And she's more focused in sort of domestic arrangements, but it happens at work too. And she talks about false incompetence as dominance under a guise.
Right.
So right. It is.
She sings that.
She sings that. Oh, it's a great song.
Oh, that's great.
It has become great. I'm like, this is why I keep writing these things, because it's a very good song. But I think what's interesting is that's exactly what he was doing. So another thing that he did was and there's sort of an infantilization about it. He was doing it to himself. Like, he had his assistant bring him sandwiches, and she had to cut the crusts off.
Yeah, come on.
Right. And so I think
people watching the show from LA are like right now going, what? It's completely normal. It's the job description, so.
Well, so I think that the idea of the weaponized incompetence is, to me, deeply rooted in cultural norms and gender expectations. Right. So I see this behavior in the workplace all the time. And primarily, I see it from white men. I've seen women do it too, but I think it is primarily something that white men do, because there is a socialization that white men grow up expecting, and other men too, to some degree, and some women, but they grow up expecting that other people are going to take care of them emotionally. Right. It's almost so they feel like they can outsource their own emotional regulation. The women around a man, are supposed to sense and anticipate his needs, cater to them, and prioritize his comfort, ease, and well-being over their own, or actually anyone else's in the circumstances. And so in that regard, this learned helplessness or weaponized incompetence, wherever it falls on that continuum, is constantly being reinforced as a way for men to move through the world.
Right.
Do you think it's gendered or not?
Well, I've not necessarily. Because I think I mentioned on last week's show, the boss I had who slammed the phone book down on me. And I think that was part of it. She called me into her office and asked me to get something for her. I said, I'm on deadline that expires in a minute. I got to get this to somebody else, but I'll do it right after. And she goes, fine. But she must have thought about it, and it didn't sit well with her. She grabbed, in the old days, the Yellow Pages, walked over to where I sat in the cubicle outside of her office, slammed it down on my keyboard. My hands were on the keyboard, so it was on top of my hands on the keyboard, and said, do it now. So clearly, given her time schedule and my time schedule, she probably, the time it spent to get up, get the phone book, get out of the office, walk over to my desk, raise it over her head, and slam it down on my keyboard, I think she probably could have looked up what she had, because after I walked into our mutual boss's office and said I wouldn't work with her or for her anymore, I did look up what she wanted me to look up, and it took me exactly probably about, 45 seconds. So a point was being made there, but it was it didn't play out well. So most of the instances I've seen, it has been gendered, but I think that has to do with the structure of business in America, right? Most of my bosses have actually, it's about 50-50. Most of my bosses have been men So that doesn't make maybe 55, 45. But I have to say the bosses I've had that have been women have been much better, with minor exceptions. And, one of those bosses, sexually harassed me. And she was a nice enough lady, but that wasn't my job description as a guy who was just about to get married. That wasn't going to happen. So it's a weird thing. It's a weird. And I have to tell you honestly, if you are an executive assistant, if you're in a position like that in Los Angeles, you will get called on to do stuff that seems absolutely crazy, but everybody sort of understands that that's a job. And good executive assistants that I've known are making crazy amounts of money to completely affiance themselves to this other person's life, interest, and habits. And I'm talking about, I talked to some woman who was an executive assistant at a big international finance company, and she had no life, but she was also making $300,000, which is a pretty good uptake for somebody with just an associate's degree. So I think a friend of mine once said it, and it didn't really make me feel any better. It says, well, most people know what the job is when they take it. And,
I think that I would argue that the boss who slammed the phone book down on you was clearly a bad boss, obviously had major issues with emotional regulation. It was just jettisoning any sense of responsibility. But I would not say that that's weaponized incompetence. So to me, to me, weaponized incompetence would have been if that woman said to you, I'm just no good with Excel. I'm going to need you to do our entire P&L reconciliation for the boss. And I'm going to need you to do all this by tomorrow. Like, I just can't. Right. So think of weaponized incompetence as a sort of ineffectual hand flapping, like, I just don't know how to do this. And the idea is they're tossing a task back to you that is not yours to do. And I think the reason that this is, we face this a lot in interpersonal relationships as well. There's a very marked difference that data shows. The Pew Research did some studies on this, that the majority of housework, childcare, and just running a home in a opposite sex couple will fall to the woman. Right? The vast majority. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't men who participate fully, but they are the exception.
Okay.
Why am I getting a face right now? Why am I getting a face?
Maybe you could send me that study so I could pass it out at my household.
The point is that this is a dynamic that a lot of women are familiar with, right? So do you think when it happens in that when it happens in a workspace, in a workplace and setting, that they have a predilection for falling into it because it's just what happens at home? I think it's not. I think that women have a predilection to fall into that pattern of behavior because they are socialized to do it from the time they are infants. And so we grew, at least, and maybe it's different for women who are younger, but my understanding and in talking to women about this issue is if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s or older, you were taught that this is your job. And out of the gate, right? Whether it's to your brothers or your father or to other people, the idea is a man is having a feeling, a man needs, a cup of coffee. It is your job to make sure that he has that. Like, think about that. The dinner parties when I was a kid growing up. And again, I don't feel like my father fell into this role. I feel like we had a pretty egalitarian, kind of upbringing and family. And, there's a bunch of Italian women who are like, excuse me. But I do think there was the dynamic of like, the men are talking, the women get up and go do the dishes. Right. And
not in any household I grew up in. But see, I have an unusual household that the men are born in my family pretty much approximately every 50 years. There's my Uncle Sammy, there's me, and there's my grandson. All of the other men in the family married in. So I had tons of like aunts and female cousins and 4 sisters, I got 4 daughters. So it was that stuff didn't go on at my house. Growing up. Moreover, I was not surrounded by that. I mean, I remember going over to a friend's house once and he goes, "Mom." And his mom was like in another part of the house and she comes into the living room where we're sitting and he goes, "I want some orange juice." Dude was 17, my mind was blown. I would never in a million years think of having done that to anybody in my life. Man, you're crazy. I get nervous just thinking about it. If I called my mom from another part of the house, she came into the room and said, "Hey, could you get me some orange juice?" I'd have been sleeping out in the backyard.
Was the kid who asked for the orange juice white?
You know the answer to that question.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth naming, right? Because the men that are in power in most of corporate America are white men, right? A lot of them are over 40, so they have grown up with this dynamic. And let's talk specifically about what you can do if you work for somebody who is in this situation. So I want to be really clear about the fact that there are people who have power and people who don't. And your reaction to this at work is going to be dependent on the amount of power that you have. So when we were talking about the bad boss who had his secretary print out his emails or his assistant.
Right.
I knew his assistant and she was fantastic, incredibly competent. We were friendly. She clearly was not interested in participating in this dynamic. And it was part of her job. So she, she was very professional, but it was clear from her expression that this was not, she didn't feel like this was the best use of her time. She didn't stay at that job very long. But she didn't have the power to do anything, right? Like you were talking about these assistants in Los Angeles. I mean, like there are people who their job description requires that they do, ridiculous things that their bosses could potentially do for themselves. So there wasn't much that she could do. I think that if you're in a situation where you are having this kind of behavior come to you, what I would suggest is if you have power, right? Let's say you're a peer or you are senior enough and this is somebody who's superior to you. What I would suggest you do is make him, and I'm just assuming it's a him, make him use his words. Right. So a lot of men are so conditioned to this behavior that they will not actually say the words out loud. Right. They'll just assume that you are going to anticipate their needs. So, kind of a.
Well, give me an example.
So let's say that there is a task that someone doesn't want to do. Let's say that they need to build a long PowerPoint presentation to do the next day, and they don't want to do it, and they want their peer to do it. And so the one who's trying to not do the work might say something like, "Well, I have a draft. Why don't you see what you can do with that?" Right. And clearly what he means is, I want you to write the entire presentation, which I am going to present as my own work.
Yeah.
The woman in that case could say something like, "And so you're asking me so you want me to write the presentation, right? Like name it." "Well, no, I just want you to take my ideas." "Okay, so then I'll send it back to you and you will do the back half of it. So I'll do the front." Like really make it, make him say it, make him acknowledge you are making me do the entire presentation, which you are going to present as your work. Right.
Right.
Another tactic could be to, again, naming is always very powerful. Be clear about what that means to you. Okay, so if I'm writing the presentation that's due tomorrow, I do have these other 2 deadlines that are also due to the client by tomorrow morning. So do you want to take those or do you want me to assign those to Jane?
Yeah.
Right.
I had with a convicted felon, Carlos Watson. He had a section on the media site that we used to work on together called Ozzy Media, called C Notes. And I remember the first time he had actually asked me to write a few C Notes, which I would thought was strange because C Notes stood for Carlos Notes. So I did the first one and I put my byline on it because I wrote it. And he was like, "Yeah, if you could change it to make it sound a little bit more like me." And I hadn't got that fundamentally I was ghostwriting for him. And ultimately, I never got it. I did three pieces like this, put my byline on all of them. And he said, change it to make it sound more like me. I go, well, it's good as it's written. Just put your name on it. And then rather than subject himself to the shading that he was feeling like he was getting, after the third one, he just asked an intern to do it. He just stopped asking me. So I think that's what we call fighting fire with fire. Actually, I was not responding with incompetence. But I didn't understand that what I was supposed to do was go for the okie dokie and just put his name on it and write it as tonelessly as possible. I wouldn't have done that anyway. I couldn't bring myself emotionally to do that. So,
but you were naming what he was asking you to do in an open way, which I think is very skillful. And I do want to call out one kind of big caveat. So one of the things that I talk about is the idea at work of a scope of practice. And this is something that I learned from my daughter, who is an RN, that in the medical field, there are scopes of practice. There are certain things that you can do. So she's a very experienced RN, but she can't, I think, intubate someone. Right. Okay. And there are things that and so what you want to be doing, if you imagine the scope of practice as a band, you want to stay at the top of the band. Right. And so, for example, a neurosurgeon is perfectly capable of changing a bandage or cleaning a bedpan. But it doesn't make sense for her to do that because she's a neurosurgeon. It makes sense for her to be doing things that only she can do. An RN or a CNA can do those things, but they can't, operate on the spine. And so there. What
does she call it? Scope of what?
Scope of practice. So it's it's what you are legally and allowed to do. Right. So like these are the tasks that you can do. And what I think is useful is that a lot of times what you'll see is leaders who are working at the bottom of their scope of practice. And it's just not effective. Right. Like if you have a high level of expertise, why would you not spend most of your time at work using that expertise to advance the goals of the organization rather than doing something that an intern could do? And so that is a big caveat. If you are being asked to do something because it is in your scope of practice and not in your boss's, that's an effective division of labor, right? So for a CEO to say, I need you to do my expense reports to their executive assistant, that's a perfectly appropriate division of labor. The CEO is not saying, I am not capable of doing my expense reports. What she's saying is, this is not the most effective use of my time. But that's a very small percentage of these asks. Usually it is the kind of, I just don't want to do it. And I am used to people catering to me. And I think the challenge is that it's very damaging to the people around, right? So if you are doing, like if in that example, if a woman is writing the man's presentation, he is presenting it as his own work. She can't do her own job. So she's not moving towards her own individual goals. And he's not going to give her credit for having done it. Like that's not how these people work. And I think, but there's one other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is if you find yourself is in these circumstances at work, I do want you, especially if it's happened repeatedly or there's been a pattern of this at work at various jobs, I want you to look at your part. So there are people, and again, I do think this is gendered. I see this happening more with women who are martyrs at work. And they want to do all the things, right? So they will not, let's say that there's a particular type of software that is integral to the processes of the organization, and they gatekeep that software, right? They don't want other people to learn it. They want to be the one who, does a particular task. And so it's not, in that case, it's more of that duality. Like they're participating in the learned helplessness of the people around them because they are not allowing them access to the information or the skills. And that, for a lot of people, that makes them feel powerful, right? It makes them feel like they're in control. If they're the only ones that have the key to the closet where the coffee is, then everybody has to come to them. And those people can be recognized by how beleaguered they portray themselves to be. Like, oh my gosh, I was up all night doing this. I worked so many hours. I never get a weekend off. It's like, well, because let's not forget that Stalin was a secretary. He was the party's secretary.
Said, oh no, I'm not the leader. I'm just a secretary. Or if you're a fan of that TV show MASH, Rita O'Reilly, fundamentally, or anybody in that position, they become extremely powerful.
Right.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we have taught the people around us how to treat us, and that it can be a dynamic to change. So there's a phrase that I use a lot with my executive coaching clients, which is overfunctioning. And overfunctioning is doing for another adult what they have the capacity and ability to do for themselves, because it makes you feel powerful, because you like doing it yourself. I mean, the example is to use the domestic sphere, a woman who is constantly complaining that her husband doesn't do more around the house. He goes to do the dishes and she doesn't like how he loads the dishwasher, so she redoes everything.
Okay.
That is over functioning. And that is, if you want someone to do a job, let them do the job. Let them figure it out. Let them do it in their own style. Now, I'm not suggesting that there couldn't be a husband who was weaponizing his incompetence and putting one dish in the dishwasher and then flapping his hands about, like, we need a new dishwasher, right? I mean, there's nuances to it, but generally look at yourself to see if you are perpetuating some of these dynamics and why.
In my times as a boss, I find that I've been more the martyr boss. And what's interested me about that is underlings weaponizing their incompetence. There was a guy who interviewed the director of One False Move, Carl Thomas, I think his name is Carl something. I can't remember off the top of my head. And the piece that this writer turned in was absolutely terrible. It was so terrible that the director sent me an email and said, in very nice LA terms, said that he did not have any confidence that this writer would turn out a piece that was worthy of the enterprise. I remember that phrase. And I got the piece, and indeed it was terrible, but the guy kept messing around. So the deadline had passed. I needed the piece now. So based on what I had, based on my email communications with the director, I aggressively rewrote this piece, put it in the magazine with the writer's name on it. And I expect a call any minute from a really angry writer, because essentially that's not the piece he turned in. And I get a call, and the guy says, yeah, I see the few little changes you made there. They kind of made it work a little bit better. When's my next piece due? If I'm doing 80% of your pieces, you don't get a next piece. If the subject calls me with zero faith in so it's like, I don't know. It's a weird kind of gray, like, if they're asking you to do a spreadsheet and they're the CEO, you do the spreadsheet. But what about coffee?
But does this guy, the writer, did he have the capacity to write a good piece? Because if he didn't have the talent, if he genuinely did the best that he could and it still sucked, that's just incompetence, right? He's not pretending to be ineffectual. Correct. He's just ineffectual.
That's right. And in this instance, it's a weird thing that had happened, because I didn't go into this blindly. I had read the guy's clips. Okay. And then after I got the piece from him, it dawned on me that a succession of editors had been shunting this guy's stuff along. He hadn't written any of those. Right. Somebody was like, oh my, so he had a pattern of, I'm going to be late with it. It'll be so late that they can't force me to make changes. They'll make the changes. And I got another clip. I mean, the clips were in the fight world, we call them, they were works. There was nothing real about his name being attached to any of these things. The question in my mind at that point is this guy a true believer or an opportunist, a cynical opportunist? Does he know he cannot write? And I have to say, this has happened to me a few times with writers that I want to nurture or bring up. Most of them knew they could do better, but they also knew I'd take care of it.
Right. And so that would be the learned helplessness or weaponized incompetence for sure. And I think that is a key point, because taking someone who you supervise or you're editing their work and helping them build their skills is not overfunctioning. That's your job. Right. What we're talking. And then there are also people, I mean, look at the current administration. There are people who are rank incompetence. They're not pretending anything. They just have no capacity, no intellect. They're just, that's
Should
also
not be there.
they should not be there. Right. And I think part of this is it comes around, and I think this is something that men and women do, a lot of leaders do. They're conflict averse or conflict avoidant, and they don't want to allow people to have the consequences of their choices. Right. They don't want people to, not get another clip or fail or even to have disappointment. Right. A lot of people in these learned helplessness or weaponized incompetence dynamics, they don't want to call the person on it because it's going to make them feel uncomfortable. They don't want the person to have to be uncomfortable. Right. So I think a lot of this is, if you are faced with these circumstances, do some thoughtful analysis of your tolerance for discomfort, because that is a huge stumbling block. If you can't embrace discomfort and learn to work with it, it's going to really impede you, particularly if other people around you are weaponizing their incompetence and taking advantage of you.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Okay. I think that's all we've got. Again, welcome to the new folks. We keep getting more and more people who are coming along. We're glad that you are here. Send us any questions, story ideas, your own bad boss tales to WTF@badbossbrief.com. I read every single email that comes in, and we love to get questions and story ideas. So have fun on your tour, Eugene, and we will be back in a couple of weeks.
I'll be back.
Thanks. Bye.
See you later.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief, so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.